Good morning, everyone. We are going to continue with our discussion. I'm sorry, I don't have my camera on today. I'm not sitting at my usual place, so today I'll keep my camera off for today's lecture. Kuldeep, did you want to say something? Okay, so we are going to continue with our discussion on social institutions. I don't know how much you remember of what we have done. I think what we had covered, but let me just do a quick recap in terms of what we have covered. Chanel, you can move on to the next, or yeah, this is fine. Just leave it here, please. So we were discussing, if you remember, the one of the original questions that we had was on the issue of social order and the question of how social order is maintained in society. And so in order to answer this question, one of the areas of focus for us is on social institutions, and we're trying to see how different kinds of social institutions actually contribute to the understanding of order. In this context, um, we talked about how order becomes visible or known to us through its disruption. So that's how we discussed the whole idea of the breach and Harold Garfinkel's well-known breaching experience and what those breaching experience actually show us. From there, I think what we tried to do was we discussed some of these concepts such as norms, normative categories, um, rules, institutional roles. So how those categories are useful in looking at any social institution. So the broad framework for this sort of part of the course is looking at different kinds of social institutions, trying to understand these social institutions from different sociological perspectives. So if I think of, let's say, social institutions in the context of a functionalist perspective, and you remember we talked about the functionalist perspective as a perspective that focuses on the functions that institutions perform, that all institutions can be understood by focusing on certain on how they fulfill certain essential functions. So and we'll get into the what the functionalist perspective is in a little more detail. But so we looked generally at these categories of understanding and categories which are useful in looking at institutions. But we also said that when you think of institutions, we want to show two different kinds of arguments, and we will see these arguments throughout our analysis of different institutions. The first argument is that institutions are embedded in each other, so they can't be seen as in isolation from each other. So if I think of the economy and kinship as institutions, economy and kinship are embedded with each other, which means that what happens in one institution, what happens in the institution of the family or the kinship, actually has implications for what happens in the economy. So they're socially embedded systems of rules and regulations. So the first argument was on embeddedness. The second is on the paradox between the individual and the social. And here when we say paradox, it means that all of us, we are part of institutions, we want to be part of institutions, and yet we want to retain a sense of individuality. So this kind of tension that we have between being individualistic and being part and giving up that individualism for the sake of being in institutions. This tension is a part of our lives always. We also distinguished between an institution and an organization. And I said that an organization implies a group of people who will consciously come together in order to fulfill certain commonly agreed upon goals. And an institution is a set of expected behaviors and rules. So it's more amorphous. It's a set of behaviors and rules that will enable the organization to function. So it's an institution is really a socially embedded set of rules. So when I think of this, then education is an institution, but a specific school or a specific institute is an organization. So education is an institution that involves the passing on of larger societal values from one generation to the next. And the school is the formal organization that performs this function. So a particular school may cease to exist, but its functions, but the institution and its functions will carry on. Yeah. So can we move to, yeah, all of this we've covered. All this we covered. Norms, values, roles, and status. Yes, move ahead, please. Moores and Folkways. Yeah, we can. This also we've done. We also did the, yeah, okay, this. Okay, let's, next one. What's the next one? Yeah, okay, we can just, we can go back to the previous slide. Now, okay, so if you, so when as sociologists, when we study institutions and we look at how what the processes are through which individuals are actually linked to collective spaces and to collective things, what we're interested in is the way in which these linkages create ordered scenarios. So what we're trying to do is to think about how, for instance, family, marriage, religion, education, how these are interlinked. What sorts of linkages are there between these institutions to present a certain kind of order? So if you think about the family, and again, if I think about the family in terms of the kinds of functions it performs the function of making you of producing a student. Now, so if you see yourself as a student, actually the family has had a big role in shaping what kind of student you are, and also in inculcating the values that are necessary for you to be a student. So that means that, and then of course the school has also done the same. So what you were within the family, what you learned within the family, within the school, you come to, your higher educational institution and you perform that role of a student, that institutional role. You have learned to perform that institutional role through your presence, through your being and participation in other institutions. So there is a linkage then between the family and education in this context. You see how they're embedded in each other. Unless you were socialized into a certain kind of self-discipline, you would not be able to perform the institutional role of the student effectively. And of course, there are examples where we know where many of us don't perform in that role of many of us don't perform those institutional roles. And when one or two of us, when a few of us don't perform it, those are considered individual deviances. But when many of us don't fail to perform it, that's when you think of it as a disruption of order, as a disruption of order. So when one or two of us, among us is not fulfilling those roles, is not doing what we are supposed to do, they can be addressed as individual deviances. So what, when we begin to focus on these kinds of linkages, they actually tell us about the relationship between structure and agency. They tell us about the relationship between individual and society. So we began the course by actually saying that, a large part of sociology, when we say introduction to sociology, we are really trying to get at the bottom of this relationship, explicate this relationship between the individual and the social. What are the kinds of linkages that happen? What is the linkage between structure and agency? How much are we constrained by structures, and to what extent can we establish individual freedom, individual decision making within structural context? So then this relationship between the individual and the social that sociology is interested in is primarily understood through people's being in institutions. Now, if I think about sociology and social anthropology generally, we know that one of the reasons we are also interested in institutions and looking at institutions is not just to understand ourselves, is not just to understand our place in this relationship between structure and agency, but it is also to understand societies which are in contrast to our own. So there were many early sorts of social anthropologists who were not studying their own society, but they were studying other societies that were distant from their own. And they were doing this not just to understand the contrast, but through the contrast between your own society and another society, you could attempt to understand what the general functions of some of these institutions are, what the universal principles of social order were, and how they were being used in culturally specific ways. So when we look at kinship and family, for instance, we will see what that universal principle is that binds families all over the world, right? And how those principles are used in cultural specific ways. So you have somebody like, for instance, Evans Pritchard, who studies the Nuer in Africa. And I'm just putting the name so that in the chat so that it's clear. So Evans Pritchard is a British anthropologist who studies the Nuer community and of Sudan. And and of course he studies various aspects. I just want to give you the example of how he studies the political order in Nuer society. And what is interesting about Nuer society is that he finds that there is no state or government. But he asks the question that, if there is no state or government, does that mean there is no political order? And he finds that there is political order, but the Nuer represent a stateless society where order is maintained through very specific political processes or certain institutional arrangements. And these institutional arrangements are drawn from the kinship and the lineage system, and drawn from how their livelihood is structured. So when he looks at the Nuer society as a whole, he finds that the political system there can be described as an ordered anarchy. And why does he say anarchy? Because he sees that there are too many fragmentations, and there isn't a sort of central one single central authority structure. So he says that if you look at the newer people, they're divided into segments. So there are segments such as the village, the hamlet, the lineage, and all these segments are not based on exclusive and completely separate membership. So if you think of a person in a village, the person is in a village, but also belongs to a hamlet, which is a group of villages. A person maybe in a village, but belongs to a larger lineage. So you see that you could think of this as in terms of concentric circles in some ways. And so an individual may belong to different segments, and one's loyalty may be called on depending on the nature of crisis of the nature of the crisis or the problem. So whenever there's conflict, you're called on to resolve that conflict, but your resolution of that conflict will depend on where you situate yourself vis-a-vis the conflict. So it's possible for a person to situate oneself in the village, but also in terms of let's say in terms of the larger lineage. So groups then have a tendency towards fission, which means that they can fission and opposition among segments. So it means that any group can actually be any individual can actually be can decide to be part, can break away and decide to be part of a smaller group, or they can also fusion. So fission and fusion are the two processes that go on simultaneously, which means that any person can choose to be part of a smaller group, or may choose to align with the interests of another. So I may choose to align with the interests of my small village, or I may choose to align with the interests of the hamlet, which is a group of villages. So he sees that this kind of process of fission and fusion is what, between the different segments, is what maintains political order among the newer. And of course, I'm sort of summarizing for you here just to give you an example. But what this tells us, I think, is, two things I think are important. One, that he finds that you can't then situate order when you look at another society, you can't situate order very precisely in institutions that you see in your own society. So if I think of political order as being connected to the state, I may not find the state in exactly the same way in all societies. And so does that mean there is no order where there is no state? That's the question that Evans Pritchard was actually asking. And he therefore finds that it's not necessarily, a political order is not necessarily tied to state or government. It can be located in other kinds of political processes. So this yeah. So okay, can you show me what the next slide is, please? All right. So before I get into sort of looking at these perspectives, which is the functionalist, the interactionist, and the conflict, let's look at, I want to focus on the functionalist right now. But when you think about the yeah, so when you so the functionalist perspective, I think we can stay with the slide on the functionalist. Yeah, the other one. So when we look at any institution from a functionalist perspective, what we are focusing on is what is the question of what is the primary function that the institution performs. And so if I think about marriage as an institution, marriage as an institution performs the function of regulating sexuality. It performs the function of procreation, ensuring procreation happens. And in most societies, it becomes the basis of it's really the basis of organizing units. It's a central organizing unit in society. So marriage, which is the family. So marriage becomes the basis for one of the central organizing units in society, which is the family. If I think of the family, it performs the function of providing workers for society. It performs the function of actually socializing individuals in order to make them workers. It performs the function of, again, legitimizing sexual relations between some people and prohibiting sexual relations among some people. It also provides, it fulfills the function of providing both ascribed and achieved status, and generally provides affection, emotional support, and companionship. So you think of these as, marriage and family. You see how they are clearly connected, because it's through marriage that you establish the family, and you look at what their functions are. Again, a key aspect of the functions of these two institutions are around regulating sexuality. If you think of economic institutions, the functions of economic institutions are those through which human beings' relationship with the environment is being sorted out, and this relationship is in order to fulfill the material needs of existence. So if I think of economic institutions, of course, in contemporary capitalist society, market is an overwhelming economic institution, and it is in fact the primary economic institutions. Now, in contrast to the contemporary capitalist society, if I look at let's say the primitive hunting-gathering societies, the market was not the primary economic institution. It is in fact the kinship group that is, or the household that is the primary economic institution. It is in the household that processes of production, consumption, and distribution are organized. Now, so these are some examples of social institutions and the kind of functions each of them provides. Let us look a little bit more closely at two institutions. One is the school, and we know that the school, you can look at it both as an institution as well as an organization. And through the example of the school, I want to highlight both the functionalist and the conflict perspective. So the school, from the functionalist perspective, the school performs the function of socializing the young and producing good citizens. The school necessarily perpetuates the ideals of society, whether you look at them in terms of the intellectual, physical, and moral ideals, and therefore is a critical means in promoting solidarity and stability in society. But when I think of the conflict perspective, and I'll come to that in a bit, the school also reproduces social inequality. We can discuss a little more on how that happens. But let's, Chanel, if you have that video on, it's called Schooling the World. Maybe we can watch that and then have our discussion.
Okay, ma'am, I'll just click that.
Yeah.
Dasalia yo lea nispo ene lea abomo chen mo khe tu sukula tanga na pa kyong se le bomo chen mo la ene khe tu sukula tanga lea dukse ya no mo sukula chele alea dukse ngari bomo chung se ache no mo niska ache le tu ni zoli ba jing chu ta dene balang ti le na jing chu se dene kari chi ka sho le yon se balang ma chi re skip potamino pale ya men no banga tu gozare Kong sama yang sikan song kong sukula tu tang jasong yang mana panole. Kit potala kale yang kong sukula yalba tang jadi di kabur panole. Kong sukula rule sukula yalba sale tang jadi kira ole.
Ma'am, should I resume the PPT or we'll hold a discussion on this?
Is that all? There is more there.
Oh, just a second. I think some confusion.
You can play the whole video. It's about 7-8 minutes, I think. If I'm not wrong.
It suddenly closed. Oh, it's the same video. Oh, I'm so sorry. Okay.
Daksa yang ngata de yargias panang nyambo changma ngata sekolah ta no kalali. Sekolah ta nang nyambo ini demba nang te mi unika janspa zeskanzo yang ngata ningje zesjeso yang ngata choso de ningje sonsero yari. Jezena ma ngata kitab siljes ma samjes nga doctor gyurgo sherak engineer gyurgo sherak halale. Devo samjes mini te ngata chitsok sina michik na chiga ngata yato choches na roh choches na benede sinje choches po yunga chenso.
Through our kind of cultural myopia, we sort of think that we educate our kids, we send our kids to school, we have a form of enculturating kids into our society, which is education. And peoples who don't mimic those same patterns of education somehow don't educate their kids. Well, of course, that is absurd.
Rinpoche religious church na yontan zera na po hanga chenmo so pene khopjin deni bangla chenmo yabin ni ko gari shuli ni gari na yontan is jase ko krang donta ko krang so se gyuso da na ki pene churches la yontan chua so shiga.
Today, Western schooling is responsible for introducing a human monoculture across the entire world. Essentially, the same curriculum is being taught, and it's training people for jobs, very scarce jobs, but for jobs in an urban consumer culture. The diversity of cultures, as well as the diversity of unique human individuals, is being destroyed in this way.
This particular school that was established, called the Moravian Mission School, was secular in the sense that, of course, some Christian teaching was given as a part of an evangelistic outreach by the Moravians. In 1887, when the school first started, there were certain perceptions that were wrong. For example, a school started by the missionaries on a street corner must have an ulterior motive of conversion, of teachings that are in conflict with the teachings of the traditional society or the religion.
Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven.
And I've been told that the children had to come by force to the school. They wouldn't like to. People just wouldn't send children to the school.
And forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive them that trespass against us.
I strongly believe that a secular education system and a cosmopolitan school society should not be at the expense of losing Ladakhiness.
And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thy kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
If you have lost your history, or lost everything.
Okay, so do we have any questions based on whatever we've covered so far, or do you have any comments on the video? So this is part of a larger documentary which is actually available on YouTube. If you're interested, you can go through it. But so what we are seeing here is, you see how I think both these aspects, both the functions, I mean, both the functionalist and the idea of conflict is in some ways implicit in that little video that you saw. The functionalist in terms of how does school as an organization, as an institution, how does it create a certain kind of citizen? And what you saw is that if you look at the historical trajectory of the school and the establishment of the school, you know that there is a lot of violence that is associated with how the school came to be what it is today. So we don't actually question sort of the role of the school anymore. But when you look at that history, I think it becomes clear that that the school has achieved this kind of a place in society through a lot of violence, through a lot of erasure of traditional ways of learning, traditional ways of passing on values, and traditional ways of doing things. Now, in a similar vein, you have somebody like Noam Chomsky, who also tried to build a critique of contemporary education. And what he points out is that Chomsky is that schooling is designed to ensure a certain kind of conformity, and this is something that is built into the order of things, into how we think and behave. So we don't really question these things as they're considered sort of basic to our very existence. So the education system, according to Chomsky, is really the indoctrination of the young, and it trains people to be compliant, it trains people to be obedient, to do as you're told, to stay passive and be conformist, and basically to not cause any crisis in democracy, not cause any crisis in the overwhelming sort of ideas of order in society. So according to Chomsky, what he says is that this training of not thinking much, not raising too many questions, this training primarily happens in the education system, primarily happens in school and college. And he says that the system has a lot of stupidity, and people are generally filtered out for obedience, for stupid assignments, and so on, which means that and how does this happen? That if you don't do this, then and most of us here have obviously done it successfully. If you don't do it, you're considered to have behavioral problems. So according to Chomsky, this is how the school system and this is how the education is structured. But it also creates this kind of tension or the paradox, because when you think of progress, in order for progress to really happen, you need innovation, you need challenging, you need questioning. And you can't have, you have a contradiction, because you are building institutions where you expect conformity, but you need questioning and challenging. And both these things can't happen at the same time. So you see that the video that you saw actually raises some of these concerns with the idea of uniformity, with the idea of the uniform way in which progress, success get defined. And that erases of course, it erases traditional ways of doing things, but it also erases other ideas, or erases sort of the visions, or erases the other ideas or alternatives through which we may think about society and social order. So it's almost like order is only possible through these means and not through anything else. So we are not even trying to think about other ways of being. So if I say that, that's why when you think of the capitalist society, success is defined largely monetarily. Success in education is determined largely through a numerical system of grading, of creating hierarchies, and so on. So even when as you're doing these courses, you know that it's, you define success not so much in terms of what you've learned, but more in terms of what your grades have been. And this is the way that the system is structured. So the video actually raises these sorts of concerns with the kind of uniformity that we seek to establish in diverse societies and cultures. So we are actually killing diversity in the interests of this kind of uniformity, and a lot of this is happening through the educational institution. And we also see that these attempts are linked to things that happen outside of education. So, for instance, the state, the market, corporation, government, all of these institutions have a role to play in what is happening in education as an institution. So both these, three ideas, I think, come through quite nicely in this little video. One, the idea of the kind of function that the school performs. Second, the idea of conflict or tensions within school as an institution. Third, the idea of embeddedness, that it's linked to what happens in other institutions such as state, market, corporation, family, etc. Now, just to go back a little bit and think about the conflict perspective in how we look at institutions. With regard to the school, the conflict perspective means that we want to highlight the idea that the social needs that the school is attempting to fulfill are not really, that the outcome of that is not necessarily efficient or desirable. So, so from a conflict perspective, then, we think of institutions as maintaining the privileges of the most powerful groups and individuals in society. And when it maintains the rights and the privileges of the powerful, it contributes to the powerlessness of others. So you remember when we did our section on approaches, we spoke of the critical social science as an approach. And this is what conflict perspective really is. When we think of critical social science, what we are focusing on is this tension that an institution holds within it. So when I think of the functionalist perspective, I'm really focused on, well, what functions it performs, on the idea of order, and so on. When I think of the conflict perspective, I'm focused on what are the disruptions that this has created? What is the kind of disorder that this institution has actually led to? So I focus on the conflict between groups. So when I look at the school, I see that the school actually helps to maintain, or education helps to maintain the kind of the privileges of the most powerful, and it contributes to the powerlessness of others. So a very simple example from the Indian education system is this difference between private education and public education, this difference between private schools and government schools. You see that this division then means that you create it's not a simple division. It's a difference in quality of education. It's a difference in access to infrastructure and opportunities. And I think if, earlier there was probably a simple distinction between private and public schools. And now that has gotten more complex because again, within private schools, there is a distinction between regular private schools and what are called the international private schools. So there is a big difference in the kind of facilities that will be there in government schools, in private schools, in regular private schools, and in international private schools. And all of these kind of questions of access or concerns of access are oriented towards maintaining the existing social divisions of caste, class, religion, region, language, and so on. So, so a conflict theorist would be of the view that social institutions such as education have an inherently conservative nature, and you saw that in the video in certain ways, where making any change and any reform becomes very, very difficult. So again, in the Indian context, making that change where you have making that change where making the change where we can address these kinds of inequalities becomes extremely difficult. I think in the Indian context, if you think about the Right to Education Act and the kind of changes it's trying to bring about, the change in terms of introducing a compulsory admission of students from certain class backgrounds, that we know has led to several sort of difficulties, so that in several schools, private schools, the authorities are trying to figure out ways how they can bypass that rule. And even when some of these students do join the school, they face several difficulties with regard to sort of keeping up with what's going on, because the way in which these schools and the way in which sort of the everyday in these schools is structured is very different. So so you think of from a conflict perspective, then we can see the school as as a tool for the indoctrination, as a space which necessarily maintains the caste, class, gender sort of divisions in society, divisions which are in any case oppressive and exploitative in nature. So institutions then operate in and they replicate the gendered, racist, and casteist environments within which they operate. And so for instance, you think of the idea that there is an assumption that women cannot make tough decisions, or there is an assumption about academic competence based on competence in a particular language, and this will affect routine decisions that are made in the organization. So, and this is true then of any organization. Even when you think of the workplace as an organization, you will see that routine decisions are often made on the basis of such assumptions which are linked to the larger sort of racist, casteist, gendered environments. All right. Any questions? Okay, so the next example that I want to dwell on a little bit is on religion as an institution, and religion as an institution, as you know, it performs the function of helping a community to articulate beliefs about the transcendental. So it um, so what we do is that we are able to express, sometimes through practice, our shared beliefs about the transcendental, the supernatural, and the awe-inspiring aspects of our lives. So things that we really cannot, sometimes we really cannot make sense of, but things that or things that our senses cannot very readily observe and understand. Religion is an institution that helps us to make sense of those things. So, for instance, coming to terms with things like death, other tragedies, those are the sort of aspects with which religion as an institution helps us with. Durkheim, for him, the understanding of religion is based on the distinction between the sacred and the profane. The sacred really implies those inexplicable aspects of our lives. So those aspects that we cannot easily understand and explain. And the profane implies the mundane and the everyday and the mundane aspects of our life. To draw theoretically and to think theoretically about religion and how religion has been understood in sociology, we will look at Max Weber's work. Chanel, will you see? I think I have sent you another short video.
Oh, yes, ma'am, I have the video with me. Should I play it?
Yeah, so
Okay.
we look at this idea of, again, this is an idea which looks at the embeddedness of religion with other institutions. But these two, I think, Durkheim and Weber are sort of central classical, and of course Marx as well. But for Marx, he considered religion to be the opium of the masses, and we'll come to that when we discuss Marx later on. But here I just want to introduce to you the idea of religion being embedded in other institutions, and this is very clearly shown through Weber's notion of religion.
Those who pursue religion often turn away from worldly affairs. They're suspicious of wealth and business, preferring an ascetic life of contemplation and prayer. The sociologist and economist Max Weber argued that after the Reformation, one form of Christian Protestantism, Calvinism, encouraged a different attitude to work, with far-reaching effects. Calvinists believed in predestination. A precise number of souls would go to heaven. The lucky ones had places reserved by God. However, most Calvinists were terrified there would be no seat awaiting them in paradise. They were always on the lookout for signs that they had been saved. One clear indication that they were on the guest list was that they were actively contributing to their community through their work. In his book, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, Weber argued that the Calvinists' need to reassure themselves through their industry was an important factor in the growth of capitalism in Northern Europe. They built out businesses that generated wealth, but at the same time lived thrifty lives. They reinvested any surplus and so helped fuel capitalism. Eventually, capitalism would have a life and momentum of its own. But according to Weber, at least, its initial impetus came from a theological source.
Okay, so so what do you get from that video? Come on, let's have some responses. You've been quiet through the class. Anybody? What have you understood from that little video on Weber's theory of religion? So what is interesting here is that Max Weber notes that in certain parts of Europe, the capitalist system was heightened and was very, very successful. And he tries to go back and see, well, what is it that has led to the success of capitalism in these places? And interestingly, he finds that it's the idea that capitalism was boosted by religion. So what he finds is that it's not an economic sort of principle or idea that is behind this capitalist boom, but a religious idea. And the idea is predestination. Predestination really means that the idea that some individuals are already chosen by God and so they're the chosen ones, that these people are going to be saved from damnation. These people are going to be God's chosen few. And so within this Calvinism, this idea was very strong, that this idea of predestination, that people were already chosen by God and certain people were already chosen by God. Now, you didn't actually know who were the chosen ones. Nobody knew who was the chosen one. But what emerged from this notion of predestination is that people began to regard themselves as chosen. So it is almost like it became obligatory to regard yourself as a chosen one. And if you weren't certain, or if you displayed a lack of certainty, it meant a lack of faith. So your faith in religion was exemplified through your faith in the idea of predestination and through your faith in regarding yourself as one of the chosen ones of God. Secondly, how could you display this faith? You displayed this faith through the performance of good work. So it is through good work that you could ensure this certainty that being the chosen one is demonstrated. So it's about the kind of life that you led that would signify whether you were chosen or not. So success in calling, in work, became a sign of being the chosen one. And this meant that the attitude to work was had to undergo a change. So you had to show to the world that you were the chosen one. You could show to the world that you are the chosen one through the kinds of choices you made with regard to your life, through the kind of life that you led. So what were the principles that you had to follow? You had to work very hard. So you needed a labor discipline, and you needed accumulation of wealth and austere lifestyle. So what you did was you worked very hard. You, of course, made profits, and you circulated that profit. You didn't use that profit for a lavish lifestyle. You had an austere lifestyle, but you circulated the profit back into the sphere of work. So, so all of this was used to demonstrate that you were the chosen one on the path to salvation. And this led to economic progress because it meant that people were working harder and people had austere lifestyles. So, there was a kind of constant sort of reinvestment in the sphere of work. So a religious ideal actually led to economic progress. And this clearly shows how then religion as an institution is intertwined with the economic processes. And both of these, religion and the economy, are seemingly separate domains of our lives and being. So, so we've explained then sort of two perspectives with regard to religion. I've explained the functionalist and I've explained the conflict. Now, where do you think, if I look at this Protestant ethics and the spirit of capitalism, and how it demonstrates the embeddedness of religion with other institutions, would you consider it as a functionalist perspective?
Yes, ma'am.
So it is partially, it is looking at the functions that religion is performing, and here you look at the functions not simply in terms of how it's contributing to order, but also in terms of how it's contributing to certain sort of economic, a certain kind of economic progress. Okay, any questions? Now, the other significant perspective, sorry, that we want to look at is the interactionist perspective. I don't know what's on the next slide. Could you just move to the next slide? Yeah. So we want to look at the interactionist perspective, and as the name suggests, it's about looking at how social behavior, how institutions are conditioned or shaped by our everyday behavior. And so in this, what we do is that we emphasize that it is the way in which we engage with each other, what kinds of roles and statuses we accept, what kind of groups we belong to, all of that makes the institutions. So what an interactionist would do would be to look at, if I look at the school, or if I look at, let's say, IIT as an institution, what I would do is look at what our social behavior is like in these institutions. What is the everyday of these institutions? So a formal understanding of roles is not enough to understand the institution. That's what the interactionist would believe. So a formal understanding would mean, so if I think of this idea of religion and capitalism, in some ways that's a formal understanding because you're behaving according to certain principles. But if I actually started looking at how people are behaving, what they are doing, who are the ones who have a conflict with this kind of view, how are they disrupting this kind of order between a religious institution and an economic institution, then that would give me an interactionist perspective. So if I look at, again, going back to the example of the school, if from an interactionist perspective, if I look at that particular school that you saw in Ladakh, how are traditional values, a question could be that what is the everyday like and how are traditional values preserved through certain everyday actions? So what is happening in the family? Does the family create a space of conflict with the kind of ideas that are being taught in the school? And there we will learn that simply because the child learns a certain kind of disciplining within the school, it may not necessarily mean that that disciplining is sort of carried through in other institutional spaces. So an example that I wanted to give is the study of this by the sociologist Dunier, who looks at sort of women workers in a law firm in Chicago. And the point of looking at this from an interactionist perspective, or looking at this organization, this workplace, from an interactionist perspective, is that he wants to uncover the informal ways in which people act and behave. And he says that if you look at it from a formal perspective, you will see that here are these women, they work, he calls it the network center, which is this large office. It's a women who are doing word processing work for the lawyers in the law firm. And the women workers, they work in shifts. Each worker has a cubicle and just enough room in that cubicle for a keyboard, a terminal, printer, and a telephone. And all the work assignments are formally placed in the central basket, and then they're completed according to precise instructions. So on the face of it, when you look at this scene, it will appear that these women have very little social contact. There's very limited agency. But when you observe the everyday behavior of these women workers, you find that there is a lot of social contact, that they figure out ways of bypassing the strict schedule and the shift, and are able to engage with each other. There is they have several private moments to have conversations. They have a critical perspective that they have on the lawyers and the attorneys. So it's possible to see that there is a deep sort of informal world within this formal organizational space. So the interactionist perspective helps us to bring out this informal world. Again, I mean, an example from my own work in the prison, where when you think of the prison, you think of a very regulated, rigid schedule. You think of, again, interaction as being very controlled, very fixed time, a fixed time for doing different things like eating, sleeping, and so on. So there is a rigidity to the everyday schedule, and to how people behave within the institution of the prison, within the organization of the prison. When you look at the everyday, you will find that prisoners always find ways of subverting some of these rules, of engaging with each other, and the way in which they engage then can completely change this formal idea of how a prison functions. So it's possible then, through the interactionist perspective, to think differently about the institutions. And then there's sort of obvious kinds of interpretation. So if, again, whether you look at the school, whether you look at the prison, whether you look at religion, whether you look at a workplace, there is a certain understanding of these institutions through the performance of the formal roles of the people who inhabit these institutions. But the interactionist perspective argues that it's not enough to merely look at these formal roles. There is a world of informality. There is a world of everyday behavior that will actually sometimes contradict, but also add depth to that institution. So an interactionist perspective then enables us to understand this everyday behavior and how this everyday behavior shapes social institutions. So there is a view of how the classroom is to be structured in an educational institution like IIT. We know that that view is that formal view is constantly being reworked by our everyday behavior. All right. So I think I'll stop here today. If you have any questions, you've been quiet all through the class. But if you have any questions, we can take them up now. So this week we will not have any tutorials. I'll put up the content for the tutorial by the middle of the week, and then the tutorials will start again from next week.
Excuse me, ma'am.
Yes, Jahnavi.
Ma'am, I wanted to ask, like it is not very related to today's discussion, but like why it is very important for in India to speak English? Like, is it because we were a British colony, or like because of lack of job opportunities, and jobs are easily like available for the people who are better at speaking English? Like those call centers from all around the world are located in India and all. So the importance of English in India, like I have seen that people from other countries like Japan and France, and they don't give like this much importance to speak some foreign language with such fluency and all. So why is it so in India? Is it because of lack of jobs, or that we were a British colony?
I think if you look at that film, one of the things it's trying to say is that that the colonial context is very significant in making English as a sort of official language, and also in making English sort of prominent in our lives, basically. So it becomes, I mean, the use of English in school. I mean, why is English used in school? That is clearly, there is a colonial logic to why it became important. So that there were, I don't know whether you missed that, but there was a little a quote from Macaulay, who says that you want to create a class of Indian citizens who are who may be Indian, but they have to be English in their taste and in their in their language and so on. So clearly there was a kind of civilizing mission that is associated with colonialism. But when we critique the civilizing mission, we know that what it did was that it killed the diversity. Now, if I think of India, and I don't think we can, the importance of English cannot simply be associated with colonialism itself, but it's also connected to the whole focus of how we had to build a national identity. So partly when you think of historically, when the British came to India, it was a time when India was not imagined in the same way as it is imagined. Very fragmented little kingdoms, and you had all these rulers who were trying to retain their privileges. It's very, very diverse, so there wasn't a sort of single unifying language at all. And so that's the context in which first the East India Company, and then the British sort of crown as rulers came to India. That's the context in which this happened. But so it's not just colonialism which is responsible for making English or enabling English to have the kind of significance as it does in society, in contemporary society. But it's also sort of the nationalist question, the independence movement, the elite, the rulers at that point, that we all know that there is a there was always a group of elite leaders, and these elite leaders were English educated. They were, they were trained in universities abroad, and yeah, so I think that the importance of English as a language in contemporary society can be connected to our history of colonialism, and our history in terms of building a national identity, a history of imagining India as a nation. So it really comes together, India as a nation comes together in terms of that history of colonialism, and in terms of trying to bring very diverse groups, regions, communities, linguistic communities together. And you see some of these tensions even now. I mean, if you, anyway, I mean, if you go to Tamil Nadu, for instance, again, people don't speak. There are several people who do not speak, who may not speak with you in Hindi or English. And so there is a kind of linguistic pride in certain parts of India, which still exists. So even though you have, and if you think of, if you think of Hindi as one of the primary languages, and again, Hindi is spoken in only a few places in, and that too in the sort of in the northern region. So from a conflict perspective, you see how the making of English as sort of the language has led to these kinds of conflicts, and has led to this kind of omissions and oppression and exploitation. I don't know if that answers your question fully.
Ma'am, it does answer my question, but like I wanted to ask, like even today, basic things like people, like children from first standard speaking the first prayer in English, they don't even know the meaning of few words which they are speaking, and still they are praying in English. So we being aware of these kind of things, that it is because of colonial influence, shouldn't we change those basic things at least?
So I think, I mean, I don't know whether I think there is a kind of deep-seatedness to what we have already built. And in a current context of a globalized world, which has already moved towards and which works on certain principles of uniformity, I think it would be very difficult to now assert certain kinds of linguistic pride. If you did, then, that's why I said it's not just the colonial history, but it's also about how we have attempted to resolve the question of an Indian nation. What makes us a nation? And, in a big part, and I'm sure we all learned this in school as well, this whole idea of unity in diversity, that somehow India comes together as a nation. And despite its diversity, despite its fragmentation, you can imagine India as a nation. Now, what is this idea? What is it that brings India together as a nation? What are our commonalities? So somebody who resides in Punjab versus somebody who resides in Kerala, what sorts of commonalities do they have? Culturally, linguistically, they're, in all aspects, they're very, very different. And yet they're part of the same nation. What is it that brings us together is a question that I think is not very easily resolved. So even though we are aware of the way in which English has led to erasures of diversity, the way in which English language can be exploitative, the way in which it doesn't allow us to then decolonize, even though we are aware of these things, I think it's very, very difficult to decide otherwise. It's very, very difficult to decide that we will not teach English, right? Because of the way in which, again, it has, it's sort of embedded in all our institutional spaces, in education, in the workplace, in in the government, in state. So in all sorts of institutions, English has been and has become and has been the primary language. So how do you, and I think that if you look at some of the sort of decisions with regard to education, there is an attempt to move beyond this. So, in the new education policy, for instance, one of the things they have is, I think it's called the 3-language formula, if I'm not mistaken. But what they're trying to do is to say that you will learn English, you will learn Hindi, and you will learn another Indian language, right? And so in certain places like Maharashtra, you will learn English, and you will learn Marathi, and you will learn Hindi. So you learn more than one Indian. Each person knows more than one Indian language. So I think you could think of that as a way of then trying to address or trying to question the kind of relevance or significance that English has had in our life. But to think of a scenario where we've completely done away with this and we have achieved a system where we don't attach that kind of value to the language, I think that would be very, very difficult, because that diversity, that linguistic diversity, and the significance of that linguistic diversity has already been erased.
Thank you, ma'am. Now it is pretty clear. That unity point of view I was missing on that. Thank you, ma'am.
So all of this, I think what Chanel is mentioning about how language and proficiency in a particular language becomes the way to understand your intellectual capabilities. Yesterday I was chatting with my daughter and her friend. They're in class 8 and they have to make presentations. And her friend said that it doesn't matter, the content doesn't matter. As long as you're able to articulate and speak in English properly, the content really doesn't matter. You just have to be fluent, and you can say whatever you want. You will get 17 or 18 on 20 if you're fluent. So it was, so you see that there is, that linguistic capability is so strong that the focus on that linguistic capability is so much that you have children who are saying, what we say doesn't matter, what we learn doesn't matter. Are you able to present it well? If you're able to present it well, that's all that's important. And so I think it's quite significant that it becomes a way of proving. English becomes a way, or fluency in language becomes a way of understanding whether you're capable of not or not, whether you have what your intellectual capabilities are.
Yes, ma'am. And also in a society like ours, especially like such an urban area such as Vasant Kunj or like any South Delhi area, what I've observed is that as long as you are even saying something which is not morally very welcoming, but if you're saying it in English, then you get to be branded as a very civilized person. So this whole also this whole embeddedness of how civilized you are, even if you are, whatever you're saying doesn't matter as long as it is in English. So this how English shapes our sociality in everyday life in India, and how we have internalized it to a great extent. I think it is something that it becomes quite interesting to observe that not just how Western imperialism or colonialism has impacted us, but also if we take the very bottom to top approach, we also realize how much we have internalized the language itself, and how it is a social fact, how it mediates the structures around us, because whenever we go out to get a job, I mean, it is a reality in India that, you know, we very often hear people say that agar English aati hai to 20-30 हजार की job मिल ही जाएगी किसी को. So that sort of reality, social reality is out there. So taking cognizance of that, how, and this also tells us what Weber himself has studied, this link between religion and capitalism, and also language. Yeah. So just that.
All right, I think it's past 9:30. We can end the class, and I'll see you on Thursday.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Also, ma'am, before we end this, I think we should clarify if they have to make the TUTH submissions as well. I mean, we know it won't the TUTHs won't happen, but do they have to make the response note submissions?
No, we are not. For whatever we've finished, no more submissions will be accepted now.
Okay. And ma'am, for the submissions ahead.
Yeah, so once we start, they will have to do the submissions.
Okay, ma'am. All right.
So from next week, we will start the tutorials. This week, we will not start the tutorials, but class notes for today, did we take note of who's going to do the class notes for today?
No, ma'am, but I'll just ask them on the group, and we'll just take
Okay.
down the names of those who are submitted.
Yeah, okay.
Thank you, ma'am.